I would like to introduce our second speaker. Professor Oliver Berman is a professor of animal welfare at the University of Lincoln. I've also known Oliver for a long time because he was also at Bristol, where he was one of the key people doing the foundational work looking at cognitive measures of welfare using behavioural indicators. So he's very well qualified to talk to us about behaviour to give us insights to welfare today. Oliver does a range of work, including really fundamental aspects of cognition that underpin animal welfare. He studies the refinement of behavioural and cognitive methods to assess affective state. And he studies a whole range of species. So particularly of interest, and what he's going to talk about today, is some of the more unusual or exotic species. So he's going to talk a little bit about behavioural measures of welfare in some of the species where those signs might seem to us a little bit more inaccessible. So, for example, vocals that we can't hear, or species where it's much more difficult to read behavioural signs, such as reptiles. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much for that, Rachel. As you'll notice, no medals for me, unfortunately. I think I did get a gymnastics badge when I was about 6, but I'm not sure that really counts. It was for doing a somersault. Yes, as was just said, I'm going to talk about species that perhaps we're slightly less familiar with, but how we can still, with a bit of caution and care, we can still use their behavior to understand about their welfare. So I'm calling this accessing the inaccessible, which is slightly difficult to say. And what I mean is it is accessible, but it's slightly difficult. But we can achieve that by following certain different approaches. So I'm going to talk about two different sort of strands. First being that for some species, their behavior may seem inaccessible simply because their perceptual abilities, the range of say, sounds and smells that they can make and they can detect vary so differently to our own. So in terms of visual signals, the example would be with birds, that they can see ultraviolet light, whereas we can't. So we might miss some of the cues they're giving. You'll be very aware that compared to, say, rodents and dogs, our own olfactory sensitivity is far reduced. But I'm going to focus on auditory signals. And here's the idea that basically animals could be making sounds that we can't even hear. So if we can't hear them, then we're missing out on a whole potential world of information we could be using. So then the other strand I'm going to talk about is about familiarity and similarity. So the idea that some species we're just less exposed to, we have less history with, so we may be less familiar with them and their behaviors. But also because of the phylogenetic distance between us and some species, it may be harder for us because there's greater dissimilarity to recognize some of the behaviors that they may be showing to us. So first up, the first bit is looking at auditory perception and talking about ultrasonic vocalizations in rats. So most of you will be familiar with most rat behavior and indeed some vocalizations. If you ever pick up a rat unexpectedly, well, when it's not expecting it, you might hear an audible squeak, for example, but they also produce vocalizations in the ultrasonic range. So on the right-hand side here, you can see our range of hearing, which goes up to about 20 kilohertz. As you get older, like me, that slightly starts to come down, so you can't hear some of the top frequencies. But for rats above that 20 kilohertz, which is the ultrasonic range, then they can hear way up to a bit beyond 100 kilohertz. So there's this whole sort of gap here where they're able to hear sounds and produce sounds that we're entirely unaware of, unless we use something like this, a bat detector, to translate the inaudible frequencies into audible frequencies that we can hear. And so they produce vocalizations in this range, and only by using these sort of bat detectors can we become aware of it. There are other sorts of equipment as well. So how do we go about assessing what these might mean about emotional state and therefore welfare? Well, there's sort of, again, multiple approaches we can use. The first is to see in what context are these vocalizations produced. Are they produced in consistent contexts that relate to the same sort of valence, which you've already heard nicely being described, positivity and negativity? And also as communication tools, then there should be some impact on other individuals. So we can play them back and see the effect on the behavior of other conspecifics. So firstly, when are they produced? So adult rats emit vocalizations in two broad categories, at 22 kilohertz and 50 kilohertz. So the 22 kilohertz ultrasonic vocalizations are produced very uniformly and consistently in experience of or anticipation of negative events, so events that are negatively valence. So when they see a predator, so it's known as an alarm call for rats, or when they're in situations of social defeat. So with rats, when they go into some aggression between two individuals, one will pin the other upside down, and the one upside down will then often receive aggressive grooming when it's groomed repeatedly by the other individual. And then even when the other individual moves away, the subordinate rat can stay upside down, that's my impression, for several minutes sometimes there. But while it's doing it, it produces these 22 kilohertz vocalizations that you wouldn't hear it, but you can sort of see their chest moving, but you can't hear anything unless you use a bat detector. So very consistently produced in this negative context. Whereas the opposite is seen for 50 kilohertz calls. They're produced in experience or anticipation of positive events. So when they're eating a really nice food reward or anticipating the arrival of a really nice food reward, when they're involved in play, either with other conspecifics or also with humans. So if you work and get a relationship with a rat, then it's known as tickling, and they can produce these 50 kilohertz calls during that interaction. And you can tell that it's positive because, again, they keep approaching to have engage with more of it. And also psychostimulants can produce these calls as well. Now, I won't play them back because you won't be able to hear them. Or maybe I am playing them back and you have no idea. I remember the first time I got my bat detector and went in a room full of rats and thought, oh gosh, it's going to be amazing. This whole world's going to be open. And it was complete silence. So they don't produce them all the time, but they do produce them occasionally. So on the spectrogram, the top one is the 22 kilohertz call. It's got a flat call, whereas the 50 kilohertz is more of a trill. It's a bit more wiggly and obviously it's a bit higher frequency. So that's the context in which they're produced. It shows nice consistency with positive and negative valence. What about the impact of the playback? Well, as you'd expect, when you play back the 22 kilohertz call, rats avoid it, or you inhibit their emergence from a shelter. Whereas, again, as predicted with the 50 kilohertz call, this induces approach behavior from rats when you play it back to them and encourages them to come towards you. So when you take this evidence together, these two different ways of trying to tackle the question, the results indicate that these ultrasonic vocalizations can tell us about the welfare of rats, because when a rat is vocalizing, if it's producing 22 kilohertz call, it's in a negative emotional state. When it's producing 50 kilohertz, it's reflecting a positive emotional state. Now, obviously, just because they're producing that doesn't tell us about their welfare, but in a situation where they're producing a lot of 22 kilohertz calls, maybe they're in a cage with another individual that they can't escape from, that's when there's an impact on the welfare. And also a nice thing about the vocalization playback is that it can be used to potentially induce positive welfare as well. By playing back these positive calls, it can, just as you heard described by Christine so nicely, have a contagion here, an emotional contagion from one individual to another. And the use of monitoring vocalizations is increasingly popular because of this. It can be automated as well. So you can trigger when you hear certain vocalizations happen, go and investigate and see if there's anything that's going wrong. This timer going down is a bit disorientating because it's gone down from 10 minutes rather than 15. So let's move quickly on to the second phase, which is talking about species that are less familiar to us. We don't see them so often, and they're very dissimilar to us. And also, I should point out, I'm going to talk about reptiles, and I'm as guilty as anyone. We often talk about, oh, can reptiles do this? We wouldn't use the same language when talking about dogs and cats. We don't go, oh, mammals can do this. And that sort of lets us forget sometimes the huge diversity of species and therefore behaviors that we're going to see. They're increasingly as common as pets. There are a lot of health and welfare issues associated with them. And one of the potential reasons for this could be this lack of easy recognition of behavior, indicators of poor welfare, particularly at an early enough stage to get effective treatment. So how do we go about assessing these behaviors in reptilian species? Well, this is quite a difficult thing to do. There aren't many measures existing. So what we can do is try and put them in scenarios where we have a good confidence that there's going to be a particular valence, and then see what behaviors change as a consequence. So in this instance, we put tortoises in situations of novelty, and generally when animals are exposed to novelty, they show anxiety and negative emotion-like behaviors. So with the tortoises, when they're exposed to novelty, we do see a general change in their activity, and this is an increased latency to move, by which I mean it takes longer for them to start moving. And you can see that graphically here. When they're exposed to a novel environment, they take about a minute before they start moving. When they're in a familiar environment, they move almost instantaneously. And that measure is seen very typically in mammals and birds as well. So I've called it a sort of a general measure that you can use. But they also showed species-specific changes as well. So head retraction, you'll all be familiar. Putting your head back in the shell, I think I probably look a bit like a tortoise. So they do that pulling away. But also slightly more subtly, they just extend their neck differently over time. So when they're exposed to a novel environment, their head is pulled back slightly furthermore, and then as they become familiar with environment over time, the neck extends further. So again, this is a potential behavioral indicator of relaxation and contentment within a situation. Bearded dragons we put in the same scenario, and just as an example of how different these species are, they showed very different behaviors. So in terms of activity, you'll see from the graph that basically bearded dragons don't move. They just didn't go anywhere, whether it was a novel or familiar environment. But they did show species-specific changes in tongue-flicking behavior. So when they're exposed to the novel arena, then they showed more tongue touches, in particular touching the floor and the surfaces. And we feel that this is a reflection of anxiety because we've also seen this in studies where we've handled them longer than they used to, and animals handled for longer than they used to compared to those that are handled for the normal amount of time, again showed this increase in tongue-flicking behavior, suggesting it does reflect anxiety. Again, just sort of showing the problems you get with looking at different behaviors of different species. Leopard geckos didn't show any clear associations at all when exposed to situations of novelty. So we took a different tack with the geckos, exposed them to positive environments, highly enriched environments compared to standard environments, and looked to see how the behavior differs between these situations. And what we see with geckos is, and this has been identified by other people as well, that they interacted significantly more with the barriers, the glass walls of the vivarium, when they were housed without enrichment. And this scrabbling at barriers is thought to be an abnormal behavior that reflects maybe they're trying to escape or maybe they just don't have anything else to do in the environment, but it's thought to then reflect a negative emotional state. Snakes, just trying to give you a bit of a coverage of all the different reptile species we've looked at. We looked at corn snakes. Now, they're a real challenge behaviorally. I've never known anything like it. So I talked about latency to move when we're looking at the tortoises and the lizards. With snakes, which bit of them do you measure? Because they can move just the head, just the tail, the middle, without the head and tail moving. I know it sounds obvious, but it's a real difficulty when you're trying to assess them. So they were a challenge, and they showed no real association with response to novelty either. But again, when we looked at them in highly enriched compared to standard environments, we saw differences in their behavior. And a behavior of particular interest was this one where, when they were resting, they moved outside of their shelters and were loosely coiled. And other researchers have found this as well, and it's seen in other species as well. And this potentially reflects relaxation and security, that they're confident enough to be exposed in the open. And then nicely building on what Christine was saying, one thing we found that was not different, so I've given you some examples of how things differed between the species, but one thing that was common to all of them was that if we gave them a choice, they showed a really strong preference. The corn snakes, the leopard geckos, and the bearded dragons, when we gave them a choice between the highly enriched and the standard enclosures, all had a very strong preference for the highly enriched enclosures. The corn snakes also had a very strong preference for a larger enclosure, as you can see here. So when we offered them the choice between 1 2/3 of their length and one that was allowed them to stretch out to their full length, they showed a very strong preference for the larger enclosure. Tortoises show very strong preferences for food, quality and quantity. And just to refer back to the rats and the vocalizations, a really nice study carried out by Birdolph and colleagues, they trained the rats to self-administer playback of sounds. So basically they trained the rats to nose poke, and then that would make a sound play back to them. And so then they could choose which hole to poke their nose in to get a different sound to play back. And what they found was they particularly significantly chose to play back the 50 kilohertz vocalization, you can see here, and they particularly avoided playing back the 22 kilohertz call. If you remember, that was the negative call as well. So again, showing how you can combine all of these different approaches and different types of evidence to give you a common conclusion about the emotional indication of these particular behaviours. So finally, just to echo what Christine so clearly said, that we can use behaviour to tell us about welfare. We should be aware, of course, of the differences between us and the other species, and particularly in terms of perception. We need to acknowledge the fact that other species are very different from us. Even if we're familiar or unfamiliar with them, we need to consider this. And that there's some behaviours that we can look across different species and generalise, but in other cases we really can't do that. And we need to focus really on the species-specific behaviours that we see, based on their perceptual abilities, but also their background ecology. And then we can use that behaviour to help us alter our housing regimes, management, and so on, in order to improve animal welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was fantastic. And a particularly good tortoise impression, I have to say. Very good. Okay, we're going to start the discussion with a Slido word cloud. So we're going to ask a question to you, which was the topic of the session. What does animal behaviour reveal about welfare? So from your perspective, what do you think animal behaviour reveals about welfare? So the information for getting onto Slido, I hope, is up there. Yeah. Could we put the information about accessing the Wi-Fi back on? Thank you. Okay. Is a problem accessing the Wi-Fi? Is there? Okay. I think there's a problem accessing the Wi-Fi. If you can't access the Wi-Fi, don't worry, we will pick up any points and questions you have during the session. Oh, we have got some responses, that's great. Okay, I'm gonna leave the word cloud up so we can come back to it. But it's really good to see after those presentations, there's a lot of focus on emotions and emotional state, which is great. But I'd like to start off by opening the floor up to questions. We do have some roving mics, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask our fantastic speakers this morning, please do put your hand up or put questions in through the Slido. I've got a question for you to kick off, if that's okay. You've both talked about behaviour as indicators of emotional valence, which is fantastic, very useful. Do you have any advice or thoughts about behaviours that might be ambivalent in terms of emotional valence? I'm just thinking about things like, we talk quite a lot with dogs about licking lips, for example, and it can be a sign of anxiety, but it could also be a sign that they've just had a nice treat and they're licking it off their lips, or they're anticipating food. Is there anything?
Well, I'd say it's often about looking at combinations of behaviours with those sorts of things, because you see a similar thing with self-grooming in rats. So When they're relaxed, they might look after themselves and groom, but also when they're very anxious, and in fact, when you expose them to novel environments and things like that, they show more self-grooming as well. So it can be ambiguous as to which way it goes, but if you combine that with the behavior, then together you can, or maybe with more than one, you can sort of triangulate to give you a consensus about what that means. So yes, I think taking just one behavior on its own can be difficult, and you have more confidence when you take them together.
And when you mentioned grooming, I think I'd add to that we can look at behaviours as if each behaviour is just a discrete behaviour and sort of add them up, or say we saw it or we didn't see it. But actually, the structure of behaviour tells us a lot. So I'm going to go away from horses and back to my favourite chickens. So chickens preen themselves, and if they do a long, settled bout of preening, that's a good indicator that they're in a positive state. But if they're doing lots of frequent, disrupted little bits of preening, that's an indication that they're in quite a negative state. So the total amount of preening might be the same, but the structure of it is completely different. So, yeah, behaviour is quite subtle, and there are ambivalences there. You can't necessarily just go, I'm going to measure preening and see how my chicken is today. So, of course, you all need to refer to experts, animal behaviour experts, all the time.
But I guess to kind of follow on from that, there's a perception sometimes that behaviour measures are quite subjective, but actually, when you analyse those kind of behaviours, they're very clear indicators of a particular emotional state if you take into account multiple behaviours and context and those kinds of things. Is there anything you can add about the kind of subjectivity?
I suppose maybe having clear descriptions of the behaviour so that it gives you the idea of what you're seeing. So Christine gave a really nice example there with the preening behavior. So it isn't just, it looks like it's preening, that's enough. But if you have enough clarity about the definition of the type of preening or the duration that you expect, or where sometimes they're preening or grooming, then that gives you more a sort of objective description to be able to say, oh, this is when this is happening. If you're vague about terms, and it always leads to problems, but that would be the same if you're assaying something in a lab. If you just go, oh, I don't know, if it's over 30, that means something. You have to have very specific predictions and very sort of clear descriptions for what you're looking for.
Thank you. We've got a question in on Slido, Oliver, that kind of relates to that, which is, you've talked about bearded dragons and that they show tongue-flicking behaviours in novel environments, and that's associated with anxiety. Can you differentiate that from curiosity, which is a more kind of positively valenced state?
Yeah, and that's a really sort of nice example again. So when we first saw it when they're exposed to novel environments, we were sort of fairly careful with our interpretation of what it might mean, because it could be an exploration of something new. It doesn't necessarily infer something negative. But then in a further study, when we looked at the handling, which I just sort of described, when we saw a similar pattern that gave us the sort of 2 points of evidence pointing towards it being an indication of anxiety. So that's when we made that conclusion. But I would at the same time say that it doesn't always need to mean that. So that is sometimes the difficulty with behavior, that there could be contextual differences as to when you see the behavior, and it could be an indication of something, and in a different context, it may not. So you need to be very sort of fully aware of that. So again, I'm trying to think of an example. Going back to preening, maybe in some situations it may be a sort of communication thing. It may be used in courtship or something like that, if you've got two birds watching each other. But in another situation, it means something different. So you can't just go in with a blinkered viewpoint of, I see this, this means that. You have to be aware of the context in which you see it, the individual, and what sort of state it's in terms of the season or breeding or age. So there are all these factors, and I appreciate that might make it sound very difficult, because there are all of these different factors that could potentially influence the behavior. But as long as you're aware of them, then that's the main thing. And like Christine said in her talk, these are sort of all come through and integrated in a sense to see the ultimate expression of the animal, which is the behavior.
Thank you. Okay.
Is this hi? Well, I'm not sure whether this is at all useful, but I was thinking, it's constantly on my mind, but whether animals have personality traits. So I have two tortoises, and they have quite a big internal enclosure. and one of them is very much more active than the other when it's inside. But when I put them outside in the garden, it exhibits almost a sort of agoraphobia. It always hides under a box, as if saying, oh, don't take me outside, I don't like it. So I wondered, do we have any thoughts about personality traits or even neurodivergence in animals?
I'm not sure I would go, maybe Christine can cover neurodivergence, just setting you up for that. Certainly there's a lot of research looking at personality types. Again, it's probably something in the last, 10, 15 years. There are lots of different descriptions for it as well as temperament, individual behavioral styles and so on. But yes, there is evidence. I'm not sure necessarily in tortoises specifically, but I don't see why there wouldn't be in many other species it's been looked at. And it's basically a variation in behavioral style, I suppose, in that they may all interact. It's difficult to describe. You may be at different levels of how you respond. You may be an animal that responds actively to something or one that responds less. But if then something scary happens, you both respond to that, but you're responding from different levels. So that's why it's very important to follow the progress of individuals and how their behavior changes rather than necessarily think, well, if it shows a certain amount of behavior, then it means something, because a different animal may have a different personality type that means it's starting from a different point, or it could be, age-related or something like that. But yeah, there's lots of evidence of personality types in, I'm trying to sort of look at examples now, but say right back in looking at mice in terms of animals that are the more sort of confident and active copers, and those that are the more sit and wait, flexible learners, and a lot of research, including in wild animals as well now.
And yeah, just to add, I think because of that, one of the really important things is to recognise when it comes to preference and choice that the best thing you can do is allow, if you're designing enclosures and things, is allow animals to have their slightly different preferences. So rather than designing an environment for chickens where every chicken gets exactly the same lighting intensity or whatever, having gradients really helps, because then they can go to the part that suits them best. So yeah, these personality things are stable as well over time for it to be a personality, not an instant preference at that moment. But some of these stable personality traits do map onto the preferences that animals show. And yeah, we should accommodate that.
Yes, about giving choice and making sure there are lots of options available, so multiple shelters, and as you said.
That leads on very nicely to another question we've had on Slido about preference testing. So I guess this is quite an big ethical question really, but should we be asking questions of horses if they would like to be ridden?
Yeah, wow, yeah. So we're coming into the whole social license of how we use horses. And of course, I was upfront saying that I ride horses myself. So it is a really sort of hot topic at the moment. And I think you could, but I think you have to be very careful. I think it would be worth asking horses if they want to be ridden, but I don't think you could go to any riding school or any racing yard and get a sensible result, because those horses have been trained that they haven't got much choice. So they've already been trained that they have to be ridden. So in order to ask that question, you'd have to start with a naive group of youngsters and simply set it up as you would with any other preference test without forcing them into any particular situation. So I think it should be done. I think it's a really interesting question. Personally, I'm convinced that my horse loves going out for a ride, but so does everyone else who rides horses. And if I got a 2-year-old and got on it for the first time and then said, actually, I have got a really nice example. I did have a young horse once, and this is, I'm going off on an anecdote, and he was quite energetic, shall we say, and we thought that we needed a little bit of help. So he went to a place where he was going to sort of be lunged a little bit in an outdoor arena, and with somebody who was sort of more confident than we were. So he went the first time to be lunged in this outdoor arena, and the next day they led him, and he was walking towards the outdoor arena, and he sat down. He literally sat, and they thought he was going to die of colic or something, but he sat down. He just didn't want to go back in the arena. So that, I think, because he was quite young, that was actually a good indication of a preference. that he didn't want to go back at that point. But then the more complicated question beyond that is, but maybe a child doesn't want to go to school to start with, but if you treat them well and make it enjoyable, can you overcome that initial aversion and get to a point where it's positive for everybody? So I think there are two different aspects to that, but I love the idea of asking those questions. Yeah.
It's great. It's a great question, yeah. And I guess quite a lot of the problem behaviours that people see with horses are around avoidance, because they are trying to avoid doing something like going out for a ride, napping or whatever. So I guess sometimes they are telling us that that they want to avoid doing something, leaving their friends or going on hard ground or whatever it is. Yeah.
That's a good question.
So a question from the floor.
Hello, thanks, and thanks for the thought-provoking talks. There's a lot that comes out of them, so thank you. So this is a question I probably ought to know the answer to, and I'm probably going to get my comeuppance when I ask it, and you tell me the obvious answer. But I was thinking about the valence scale that you showed at the start, and we often see. Is the valence scale just positive or negative, or are there degrees or points along that scale? And if so, how do we work to place an emotion or a particular animal somewhere on that scale? Now, it's something I've thought about a lot, and I think I probably ought to know the answer to, but I don't, I'm afraid.
Oh, wow. I mean, I'll let Oliver go in a minute. If you want, shall I
Yeah, you
give
go,
the first
you go
go?
first, yeah.
I mean, it's a really big question. In a sense, you're only ever looking at a relative preference. And yes, there's a scale, and it's not, and no, there's not a zero. So it's our words, really, about positive or negative. The only way that we would say that is if there's active avoidance, we might go negative, or active approach, we might say positive. But actually, there's no real zero, and it often depends on what the options are that the animal's making the choice between. So, you know, the choice between this chocolate dessert and that chocolate dessert, I might choose one and not the other. So is it negative that I've had? So yeah, it's not as straightforward as it's often portrayed. And a paper came out recently called, I think it was called A Consensus on Positive Behaviours. And I read it and I thought, oh, I don't agree with any of this. So I'm not sure that there is a consensus, and I think it's a really hard thing to evaluate. I think that there are certain things, though, having thought about it as well quite a lot, that are so bad that you have to get rid of those, because I think those are things where animals cannot function properly, and that their minds become completely focused on, you know, avoiding fear or avoiding harm or the pain that they're experiencing. And I think those things are negative, and we can call them negative and get rid of them. The positive is much harder, because I think it's harder to sustain as well. I think that we're all, as animals and humans, well adapted to enjoying something for a bit and then habituating to it very quickly. So it ceases to be positive very quickly, and that's tricky.
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add to that, but yes, things could be sort of relatively more positive, I think, than others, so that's absolutely fine. But then, of course, that could change. So food will be highly positive when you're really hungry, and then you eat, and then it suddenly drops down the ranking. But I was just going to add, but then Christine mentioned it, but this idea that, I don't think it's just sort of me and my personality type, but this idea that we can't be happy all the time, it's sort of you experience positivity and then you fall back to sort of, I guess, a homeostasis sort of level, whereas I think there's more acceptance that you can experience negative things for longer, more sustained periods of time. So with the positive thing, it's not really an issue of, are we going to keep them there? It's more how we can keep knocking them back up. And in some ways, that may be of interest itself, because exposing something really positive every so often is more positive possibly than when everything's always nice. If you're having cake every day, maybe it's not quite so exciting as Cake Friday when you have cake and then it's really nice. As long as you have, obviously, a very well-balanced diet for the rest of the time.
Thank you. There's another question. Thank you.
Is it on? Yes. The mammalian body is very well adapted to coping with stress. So how do we know that it's better welfare that we don't supply these stressors? Or is it better welfare? Should we not be allowing a certain amount of adrenaline buzz every now and then. How do we get this balance?
It's a toughie, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit of stress, and it is normal and perfectly adaptive. So going up and standing at a podium is quite stressful, but there's not really a problem with that. You can deal with it. But I suppose the issue would be if I had to give a talk all the time, every day, I couldn't get out, and I got very difficult questions, then suddenly that begets the problem where it becomes distressing and I can't deal with it, basically. So yes, it's perfectly adaptive and normal to experience some stress, and obviously stress can be positive and negative. But it's often the issue to do with animal welfare is when the constraints of captivity, that you can't cope with the stress, you can't escape from the stress, you can't remove yourself. You're in a rabbit hutch and it's in the sun, and you can't move away from that because the hutch is in the sun. Whereas in the wild, you would move away into a cooler area. So I suppose it's that viewpoint, that's when it becomes a concern for welfare, is when you can't adapt, you can't show the normal way of reducing yourself back to a normal homeostasis level.
No, I agree with Oliver.
Okay, so we've got a question on Slido. Can and should we try to separate wants and needs using behaviour? Sorry, that was...
No, it is a very good one, particularly in terms of preference. It's one of the areas you have to be a bit careful with preference, is that you can choose things that you want, but maybe not necessarily good for you. So you might choose chocolate cake all the time instead of your healthy salad, but that's a preference, but it may not necessarily be the best thing for you. So it can be difficult. So I think you just have to be a sort of a bit careful about the options you're giving and providing at any one stage. I'm not sure I can add too much for the moment. If you had time to think of something.
No, not really. Yes, animals don't necessarily want to go and be vaccinated, but we know it's good for them and we override it. So we, to some extent, know what they need, but it really helps to know what they want. So if you've got a dog that is quite frightened to go to the vet, it really helps to know that, and then you can put in a program that, you can talk to the vet in advance how you're going to get your dog more relaxed when it's at the vet. So understanding what the animal wants, its choices, is still, I think, incredibly important. Doesn't mean you won't sometimes override those choices.
And I guess you could say needs are things like water and food and like basic motivations. And
yeah, and you should obviously satisfy those, but I think in the idea of animal welfare now, we sort of move beyond just giving them what is necessary, that they have enough water and enough food, but have they got the right food? Have they got food that they would really value and be really positive and rewarding for them? So rather than just providing them with the same thing all the time, maybe sometimes that's a good thing, but maybe they want a bit of variation, or they want a bit of change. Maybe if it's a parrot in a cage, rather than chopping up all its food for it, maybe it wants to be able to rip it apart and destroy it itself. So absolutely you should provide and make sure it has all of the things it needs for a good, healthy life. But then in terms of the positive welfare, it's going slightly beyond that and saying, well, yes, it's got social companionship, but has it got the best social companionship? Has it got really high quality foods that it can investigate and explore? So I guess it's just providing that basis and then trying to go a bit, get the information to go a bit above and beyond that.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how experience might influence preferences. We have a question about, do you think training overrides choice?
Yep, I think it does. I think training can override choice because, I mean, there's even, to take it to the extreme, there's a phenomenon called learned helplessness, where an animal learns that its choices have no impact. It's tried to escape a situation and it hasn't worked, and it gives up trying. So that is a good example where training, that there is no outcome, influences choice. But because we've already talked about the fact that every choice that an animal makes is relative, if an animal wants to do something, but the consequences of doing that are made very negative, so the horse perhaps doesn't want to be ridden, but if it doesn't move nicely towards the outdoor arena, a whole bunch of youth opportunities people come along and hit it with a whip or some terrible scenario, it's going to soon learn that it can't avoid that situation. So training absolutely can override choice, which is why the choice and preference experiments, I think, are a gold standard for measuring what animals want, but they have to be done really carefully. You have to be really careful that you're not setting up other contingencies that you don't want. You have to allow the animals to have a truly free choice when you do them. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a quite general question here about how do you think we can encourage the public to understand animal behaviour without it leading to anthropomorphism?
I really wish Julianne was here now, because I think part of her talk was going to address this, and it was going to talk about, and if you look on YouTube or any of these social media sites, there are thousands of examples where people are wrongly interpreting animal behaviour. And I don't want to put words into Julianne's mouth, but having seen her slides, I think she was going to talk about that. And a classic example is when you see a chimpanzee that looks as if it's smiling, but it's the fear grimace on the chimpanzee. So I think that that there is a huge tendency for us. We're social primates, and we focus on what we focus on as social primates, and we interpret animal behaviour according to how we interpret human behaviour. So there has to be an element of training to understand animal behaviour. I think the best way to do it is to elevate animal behaviour to more of a sort of professional status, so that it's actually seen as something that you can take training in and become an expert in. And that, I think, would get away from the idea that you can just look at a dog that's dressed up in a fancy dress and sort of say, oh, isn't he having fun, when maybe he's really not having fun. Yeah. So I think professionalisation.
I'd agree with that, but at the same time, it's such a sort of a good advantage, really, that the general public are often very keen on animal behaviour. So it's sort of using that enthusiasm, but hopefully channeling it and educating it in a way so that the sort of understanding is there.
Yeah. I can't see Charlie Byrne. I don't. Okay. Hi. Sorry.
Hi. In terms of like reducing stress and providing enrichment for like livestock and companion animals, do you think there's enough work that's been done in that area in sort of the UK, or do you think there's more work to be done?
Well, there's always more work to be done, but you have to be careful that more work to be done doesn't lead to inaction, because there's also a huge amount of work that's been done that shows that some systems are just not acceptable. And you don't want, oh, more work is done, to be used as an excuse to never actually change what's obviously needing to be done. I think when we talk about stress, we just have to be careful, again, going back to the question that the lady over there asked before, that stress itself isn't necessarily the worst possible thing. And stress is more of that sort of that y-axis. The measures of stress are more those measures of excitability and arousal. So a little bit of stress isn't necessarily a terrible thing. So a free-range system for a laying hen, perhaps the cortisol levels might be a little bit higher, but the choice that those birds have is far greater. And so long as their health is secured, and that's really important, free-range systems secure their health, those systems offer far more potential for welfare, even if there are elements of stress in them. And there's certainly with chickens and pigs, I think there's more than enough information to just get on and make the changes that we should have made quite a long time ago. For other species like sheep, I think we know a lot less.
Yeah, I'd say there's lots of research out there, but probably, again, more can be done. And I think one of the things to note with enrichment provision is often the comparison is what you're providing. You're saying this is more enriched than that. Is it better for the behaviour and for the welfare? And if you find it is, you have to be careful, and I fall into this trap as well, of not going, oh, we've done that, or that's enriched. It's sort of the choices you're giving. It doesn't mean that that's now perfect or the best environment. It's just better than the option you were comparing it against. And so there could still be moves. So it reminds me of work with laboratory rats that I worked with a lot, that you can really enrich their cage, but it's still a cage this big with more enrichment in. It's not suddenly the most perfect environment for a rat.
Thank you very much.
There's a question here.
Hi, it's just more of a sort of a guess, a thought and just thinking about wants and needs in terms of food, because, you know, yes, many of our companion animals need food, but we have an obesity crisis. People are saying by giving choice to our companion animals that they want it, and, you know, people feel that that's a good thing that they're doing, but in actuality, it's too far with want. So yeah, I just think that's a massive welfare issue when in terms of want and need.
It's a really good point, although I think sometimes there's also a misinterpretation of what the animals actually do want. So quite often, you know, coming to say hello to an owner, what the animals are looking for is social attention, and the owners interpret that as food. So there's an understanding of the, you know, what the need is, or what the want is, as well as, you're right, as Christine was talking about earlier, that there is a kind of duty of care and responsibility to make sure we manage those wants, to make sure they're in the best long-term welfare benefits for the animals we're looking after. It's a great point. There's a question at the back.
My question is about something you touched on, Christine, about, you mentioned that horses sometimes show signs of depression, and also thinking about neurodivergence slightly, but more on the mental health side of things. I just had a quick Google, sorry. In humans, just on a Google AI, it recognises over 450 listed mental health issues, such as, you know, like anxiety, eating disorders, etc. You know, I'm not going to list all 450 here all day. But when you think about, like, mental health in humans, it's looking at depression. That is objectively a chemical imbalance in the brain, which, yes, there will be behavioural signs of that, but objectively it is a chemical imbalance. So what's the research, and do you think there's evidence, and also do you think that it's possible for, I suppose, mammals, if we're looking at humans, but other animals, Oliver, such as reptiles, to actually experience depression, eating disorders, etc., and how can we actually help those animals? Because if an animal's got a depression, you know, you kind of, can you maybe not supplement it, but treat that with, you know, an antidepressant?
No, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think that trying to investigate the other 438 mental disorders that humans might get in animals, you know, at the moment, sort of probably going far too far, because, you know, if we're going to have human exceptionalism at all, it's probably in the range of mental things that we can experience, mental disorders. But depression, absolutely. There's been a vast amount of research on depression in animals, but in laboratory animals as models of human depression. So nearly all the drugs that we get, you know, selective serotonin, whatever they are, SSRI things, all been tested on rodents. So we know that those same brain changes take place in rodents. I think that it's actually quite sort of depressing to think about the procedures that these rodents go through in order to make them so depressed that we can test the drugs on them. And I think that's a different question. But yes, animals do experience those same brain changes. Yes, they do show the behavioural signs of depression, and yet when they're being used as these experimental models, there's a tendency to ethically to go, but their depression's different from our depression, so it's fine to use them to test these drugs because they're feeling depressed, but not quite like we feel depressed. So, yeah.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. It's this whole thing of that we've been using animal models of depression for so long, and yet, you know, people then question whether animals can be depressed. But they also show anhedonia as well, so similar things where they basically don't like pleasurable things as much. So particularly it's measured, in fact, drinking sucrose solution, so sugar, sweet water, and then when the rodents are depressed, they put in these not very nice models to make them depressed, then they start to not want to drink the sugar solution and things like that. So again, there are lots of these different measures that are there. Not sure about Reptiles, we haven't looked at that as yet, but it seems unlikely to think that they wouldn't have some sort of element of it if it's seen in other species as well.
Thank you. A question at the front.
Dan O'Neill from the Royal Veterinary College. Wonderful talks, by the way, Stephen Oliver. Just when you mentioned about the parrot in the cage and the two different types of food, it kind of struck me that we're not talking about what's also in the cage, the huge big elephant, that maybe the parrot shouldn't be in a cage in the first place. And whether we're straying into welfare washing when we spend so much time trying to work out the minutiae of behaviours and emotions in a situation that probably shouldn't exist in the first place. And I'm thinking of reptiles and small vivaria as well. Just so much of, and we're going to come to dogs and cats and breeds and the bodies we trap animals in later. I wonder, are we just missing the elephant or the hundreds of elephants while we're talking about the minutiae? Just to get your thoughts. I'm thinking this is a discussion forum and it's good to rattle our cages a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, the trouble is you're at this sort of, working as a welfare scientist, you're at this sort of level where, well, we want something to be, if something isn't great, we want it to be better. So if animals are housed in laboratories, we want their welfare to be improved as much as we can. If reptiles are kept as companion animals, then we want to try and improve things. But like I said earlier, in terms of the enrichment, just because you've improved something a bit slightly, it's still the parrot in the cage, even if that is now enriched. So yeah, it's a very difficult, and you have to provide that evidence. So the example about the snakes and the size of vivarium, you'll all be aware, it's sort of quite a controversial topic, and there wasn't a real scientific evidence base for that, which is why partly why we carried out that work, to see, is there an evidence to see that they do require a bigger enclosure, that one of the few animals that don't have to have an enclosure big enough to stretch out, which does seem quite unusual. And so we had to show that evidence, but the evidence needs to be there to allow people to make the decisions. So sometimes you do think, I'm showing something that everyone is aware probably is the case, but I still have to do the work to provide the evidence for that. But you're right, going beyond that, of course, I would love to think that that I could have my own tortoise in a room this big, where it's got a huge, massive sort of territory to move in and a whole different environment. And maybe that's something you could work towards, or not even having them in captivity at all. Again, that's something, but while they are there, that's the sort of issue we have to deal with, is I can't not try to improve the welfare of the animals in situations they're already in. The issue of whether they should be in those generally is not out of my hands, because it isn't, but it's sort of different discussion, really. But I don't think I'm stopping that happening by trying to improve the welfare of animals in certain situations to make them better. Yeah, I think I've run out of words there.
Thank you, Oliver. We've got a related question on Slido, which is around, for example, a snake in a vivarium. How much is it actually telling us about welfare, whether they prefer a different size? I mean, the question here is it unacceptable or less desirable in a Travelodge versus Hilton?
Other hotels are available.
Other hotels are available.
Well, there's so many different things to sort of try and pull apart with that. I mean, if they have that preference and they choose to use it, to not allow them the opportunity would seem to be sort of thwarting a want or potentially a need. People live in very small spaces. Is that ideal? They can cope with it, they can deal with it, but I imagine also there are problems with that. Would you say their welfare is great? I think if you had the choice, you would go for the bigger hotel suite. But even then, it's not like living in a house. If staying in the hotel, it could be an amazing luxury thing. But if you're never allowed to leave it, that again is suddenly another issue. So for the snakes, I think they should have enough space to stretch out, because when they do have enough space to stretch out, they do. There could be intermediaries. Again, I don't want to sort of play this sort of middle game, but that they like to be in an area that's small, and then they have chances to explore bigger areas, and that's enough. They don't need to live in a bigger enclosure all the time, but that work hasn't yet been done.
There is there is another way of looking at it, which is to provide animals with a currency that they can use. So just as we might look at booking into a Travelodge or the Hilton, we might decide we are willing to pay the extra £400 or something to stay in the Hilton, or we might not, because we've got a currency of money that we can use. And Marion Dawkins and people have talked about using a common currency across different things so that you can separate those things out. And say for this animal, this was a relatively trivial preference, but this was a really substantial preference. The animal was willing to forego food, it was willing to give up everything else in order to get this. So there have been attempts, mostly with chickens, to do that common currency approach, and I think that matters. It just hasn't been done yet for snakes or any of these other animals, but it has been tried with chickens, yeah.
And you can look at trade-offs as well. It's like in a similar way that there've been really interesting work with sort of hermit crabs, sort of based on what sort of size of shell would you go for to avoid a certain shock and things like that. So it's sort of trying to pull out what matters most to the animals. But of course, remembering that can change over time. So food may be very important just before winter, or depending on the species. So you have to always be aware that can change that desire and need.
Thank you. So one last question before we finish the session, specifically about your rug choice trial. Can we begin to speculate from that trial that horses are able to think about their future comfort, or do we think that they are thoughts in the moment?
That's really interesting. So I don't know about the horses. Can I tell you about chickens again? So I've been interested to know, it's a lot easier to do experiments with chickens, I can tell you. So I have been interested to know whether chickens can think ahead and predict the consequences of their actions. And we can look at that by things like self-control procedures, where we say to the chickens, you can have a little amount of food now, or if you're prepared to wait for a certain amount of time, you can have more food than you would have got. And we can look at how far ahead chickens can think. And it looks like they can think at least sort of 6 to 10 seconds ahead in terms of thinking about their future needs. And the evidence that they can think 24 hours ahead is very, very weak. It looks like they don't. So chickens will tend, Ian Duncan used to give an example of chickens when they need to lay an egg, they will want to go to a nest site. And sometimes the geneticists would trap them in the nest because they wanted to know which chicken had gone into that nest. And they may be trapped in that nest for sort of 24 hours afterwards, but they still, even after many experiences of this, the moment when they want to lay the egg, they'll go in to that. So Ian Duncan used to argue that they're not thinking ahead very far. There are other ways of interpreting that. But with the horses, I don't think anyone's really looked, and I think it's an open question. I'd like to know what everyone in the audience thought about how far ahead horses can plan for the future. Yeah.
And they can also thinking, and not looking to the future, it's a completely different question, but thinking of the past, and what we did with tortoises, they showed preferences for particular symbols associated with different foods, and 18 months later, when they hadn't experienced those symbols in all of that time, they still preferred the symbol related to the high quality food that they remembered, so they're able to learn something and remember it for 18 months. So it's just, again, something that's worth considering.
And horses have social memories that go back years. So if they haven't met a companion for years and years and years, and they meet it, they'll treat it as familiar. So memory backwards, yes. Prospective thinking forwards, I honestly don't know, and I think it's just a fascinating question. Thank you, whoever asked it.
Yeah, great question to finish the session on. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our fantastic speakers. Particularly as they both extended their presentations and took more questions because
Julianne
was not here. So thank you very much. Thank you for all the questions and Slido questions. I'm going to move on and welcome some of our student researchers up to give us some presentations. So we have two student researchers whose projects Could you settle down, please, in the room? Thank you. We've got presentations from 2 student researchers whose projects were funded through Animal Welfare Foundation's student grant scheme. This is an annual scheme which encourages the next generation of welfare researchers and contributes to building a strongly welfare-focused veterinary profession. So I'd really like you to welcome our 2 speakers. First of all, we have Skye Kenny from Edinburgh Napier University, who's going to give us a presentation on exploring the relationship between habitat, biodiversity and donkey welfare, a case study in Scotland and the north of England. Thank you very much, Skye.
Thank you. So my name is Skye Kenny, and I'm a recent graduate in animal and conservation biology from Edinburgh Napier University. I received the AWF Student Research Grant last year to work on my project exploring the relationship between habitat biodiversity and donkey welfare in the UK. So I applied for the opportunity to work with AWF because I wanted to get experience in research, and I knew that I was passionate about the same values of AWF. I've been lucky to have had the opportunity to work with horses for several years, and I studied the donkey skin trade for my dissertation. So I felt like these experiences gave me the practical skills and knowledge, along with my course, to bring together like an interdisciplinary project with ecology and equines. So I'll start with some background to my study and why I think biodiversity shouldn't be an overlooked aspect of field management. A priority concern for equids in the UK, as highlighted by the British Veterinary Association, is obesity. Donkeys evolved in semi-arid regions, which required adaptations to survive on low nutritional forage. When they have access to nutrient-rich grasses, combined with a non-working lifestyle, their welfare can be compromised by health conditions relating to obesity. If donkeys have biodiverse fields, on the other hand, this can promote natural browsing behaviours and support a varied diet. The risk of laminitis might also be lower in fields that aren't stressed by overgrazing too. Additionally, these solutions can lower helminth counts, preventing the need for as much routine administration of chemical wormers, which are becoming less effective with resistance and harmful to soils. So, combining these issues, I aim to understand if there is any relationship between donkey welfare and habitat biodiversity indicators, looking to see if improvements in welfare could be mutually beneficial with biodiversity and sustainable field management. I worked with the Donkey Sanctuary to find volunteers to take part, and my fieldwork during site visits involved welfare assessment and a biodiversity survey. The welfare assessment consisted of a subset of questions from the ears tool and body condition scores. And the biodiversity survey included plant coverage estimates, proportion of wooded edge around the fields, the number of trees within the field, and I took soil samples to test for soil organic matter in the lab. So the study provided a starting point to understand the relationship between donkey welfare and environmental indicators. I found that higher soil organic matter content, a greater proportion of wooded field edge, and an increased number of trees within the field were all associated with more optimal body condition scores in non-working donkeys. And donkeys managed with a combination of rotational deworming and regular field poo picking consistently showed more optimal body conditions compared with other management strategies. Additionally, owners demonstrated a willingness to support biodiversity if it improved their donkeys' welfare, suggesting an opportunity for further engagement and education on sustainable field management. I highlighted that future work should look at ways to assess if biodiversity affects behaviour and activity budgets with the use of more in-depth welfare parameters. And finally, there's an interest among owners to find out more about bioactive forages as a natural dewormer. This might lower the amount of chemical wormers needed, which would also be better to keep soils healthier. Just before I'd finish, I'd like to thank all the organisations who helped me with this project, because it was really invaluable experience. AWF were extremely supportive throughout, and it's great to be able to share this experience with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sky. That was a fantastic and very confident presentation. Well done.
Thank you.
Are you okay to take one or two questions?
Yes.
Yeah. So I saw you running from the stage. Well, we have a question at the back.
Hello, Sky. Well done. It's very nerve-wracking, I think, to do that. So well done. So it's a very basic question. So why do you feel that the donkeys are less obese when there's more trees, wooded areas, or increased organic matter in the soil? Is this because the animals are actually just being more active? Is it improving their gut content? Why do you think that is?
So I think it's probably a combination, which is why I said I think it'd be interesting to look more into like the activity budget, because I think from what I heard, and it was difficult to capture with the survey that I had, but owners were saying that in the more biodiverse areas, like their donkeys just were moving around a lot more. And then I think also it gives them more, like donkeys are just natural browsers, so they like to kind of pick at different bits. So I think in these areas where they've got the choice, they're moving more from one area to other rather than just eating like a bale of hay in the middle of the field. So yeah, I think that's just quite good for like gut health as well.
Any more? No? We'll let you run from the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. And our second student researcher is Chloe Crichton-Feddo. I hope I've said that right. Am I? Yes, thank you. From the University of Bristol. And she's going to give us a presentation on investigating the cross-species emotional contagion. Thank you.
Right, so hi everyone. Like you said, my name is Chloe, and the research project that I'm going to be presenting today is titled Do You Feel What I Feel? And it investigates emotional contagion occurring across species, specifically between humans and laboratory rats. The data that I'm going to be presenting to you today is from the behavioural testing unit of Professor Emma Robinson's research group at the University of Bristol. And I was a summer student last year there, and the Animal Welfare Foundation, I feel very, very thankful that they funded this project and my involvement in it. So, wait, do you just press this? Right. So why is it relevant to study emotional contagion occurring between humans and rats? So throughout their lives, laboratory rats are routinely and necessarily handled during care and husbandry procedures and also behavioural experimentation. But a confound that is often overlooked in vivo scientific experiments involving animal handling is the handler themselves. The affective state of the handler during the handling interaction has the potential to influence the extent to which the animal perceives the experience as aversive, or the severity of the stress response induced by handling. This, over time, cumulatively, can have a detrimental effect on the animal's welfare and introduce unwanted variability in scientific outcomes. This situation can be understood through the phenomenon of emotional contagion, that being the spontaneous transfer of affective states and their associated behaviours between individuals. And as Professor Nicole and Professor Berman touched on previously, this is well documented as occurring between conspecifics, but this project aimed to experimentally investigate this occurring across species, specifically between humans and rats. And this was achieved by quantifying and performing a comparative analysis between both species' physiological, emotional, and behavioural responses to handling. So how did we do this? How did we effectively quantify affect? For human participants, their affective state was quantified as their heart rate, where a higher heart rate represented higher stress levels. And for rats, we recorded their ultrasonic vocalizations. So as Professor Berman very conveniently introduced for me earlier, these are the squeaks that they emit that exceed the human hearing range. And previous research by Hinchcliffe, my supervisor for this project, and her colleagues, has established ultrasonic vocalizations that they can serve as a simple graded measure of rodent affect, with vocalizations of 50 kilohertz being associated with positive affective states. So these measures were continuously recorded across 3 experimental stages: a baseline period to establish normal levels of each metric, a handling period where human handlers performed sort of a mock health check on the rats, and then a post-handling cool-down period to assess the extent to which these measures either returned to their baseline or diverged further. Additionally, both humans and rats' behaviour was observed during the handling period, and it was scored to quantify behavioural signs of distress. And finally, human participants completed a questionnaire that assessed the duration of the experience they had with rat handling and their self-rated confidence levels in handling. So, the finding that primarily evidenced cross-species emotional contagion was the correlation observed between human and rat behavioural distress scores. And this indicated that the more overtly distressed a handler was, the more likely the rat was to display signs of distress, such as struggling or biting, and vice versa during the handling interaction. And so while our well-habituated rats' behavioural responses indicated some distress, when looking at the USV data, there was a stark lack of 22 kilohertz alarm calls, and there was a significant difference in the number of 50 kilohertz USVs emitted between the handling and post-handling stages. And this suggests that the rat's affective state was not negatively impacted long-term. When looking at the human heart rate data, heart rate variance was not significantly correlated with years of experience, but interestingly, however, it was negatively correlated with self-reported confidence levels. So this means that the more confident the individual in their handling ability, the less signs of physiological distress they would display and inadvertently transmit to the animals. So, when taken together, our findings suggest that despite mild behavioral signs of distress, the increase in 50 kilohertz ultrasonic vocalizations in the post-handling phase of the experiment suggested no lasting emotional impact on the rats. This is likely due to prior extensive habituation to humans acting as sort of a buffer against an individual aversive event, such as being handled by someone the rats are unfamiliar with. Please note that not all the data obtained throughout this project has been included in this presentation. If you would like to know some more of the details, you can find myself and my supervisor. We have a poster out in the lobby. And also, if you want to know more about the habituation methods that are being developed as well, you can check out the 3H's website. And I guess directions for future research within this line of investigation should point to furthering our understanding of emotional transference mechanisms at play during human-rat interactions. This should hopefully enable researchers to further refine handling methods in the hopes of improving the lifetime experiences of laboratory rats in animal research facilities and improve the validity of the invaluable data these animals provide us. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Chloe. That was fantastic. Any questions for Chloe? I have a question. It's about, I guess, there's an upward spiral, isn't there? If you're stressed and then the rodent becomes stressed, and then you get more stressed because it's biting at you, you get this kind of upward spiral. Are there kind of practical things that you think could be thought about in that kind of situation to try and reduce that stress spiral?
I mean, it's hard to determine sort of where it originates, but I'd say within what we can control, as researchers, as practitioners, is to definitely implement training programs and practicing sessions. It's not about the fact, it's never not going to be stressful for the animal, but they can be more and more habituated to these experiences and become more familiar with the handlers as well. We've had some very interesting data about the effect of familiarity on USV emissions, which, again, check out the poster, but yeah.
Thank you. More questions?
Morning. Sorry. Really good. Really interesting. I find this sort of emotional contagion thing quite interesting. But I'm curious, because with your experiment there, say, what I'm thinking is if you've got someone that's really scared of rats, right, so they're probably quite stressed themselves, but they're really good at handling them, so are you able to differentiate between the effect of this experiment just being they're bad at handling rats, so the rats are quite stressed by the experience? Do you see what I mean? Or are they definitely correlated, I suppose?
So I don't really understand the question.
No, that's fine. Sorry, I'm trying to think about how the emotional contagion of it, the human stress, the rat stress, but is the rat stress because the human stress, or is the rat stress because that person's just bad at handling them? So did you look at the differences between handling technique specifically in relation to whether or not, say, that person was really scared of rats, so their heart rate was quite high?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we try to keep those aspects constant throughout the different trials, so everyone performed the same handling, the same way they picked them up and the same checks that they performed. So that was what we were maintaining constant. And what we wanted to look at really was the rat's response to the human's preemptive and, in the moment, physiological reaction to handling, if that's something that they can pick up on, a higher heart rate. And obviously, how that translates into more jerky or, less smooth movements. But determining sort of the chicken-egg scenario of who is starting who is difficult to determine, and I think that would require a lot more research.
No, that's fair, thanks. That really helps to understand.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please give another massive round of applause. Two great animal welfare researchers of the future. Please carry on the conversation with them. They've both got posters out in the lobby, so please do go and have a look and chat to them further about their research. I'm sure A, you will learn lots of stuff, and B, they'll really appreciate talking about their studies further. Okay, so I just wanted to thank you very much for your engagement and insightful questions this morning. As a reward, you now have a coffee break. Before you go, please just a reminder to also drop in on the sponsor stands out in the lobby and have a chat to the sponsors. And please come back for the next session, which is another group of fantastic speakers at 11:45. Thank you very much.